get going here. Well, hello and welcome everybody to today's webinar on Carbon 101. I'm your moderator, Amanda McLean, the Farm Management Specialist here at North Dakota Farmers Union. I just want to say thank you to the NDSU Extension, the North Dakota Ethanol Council, and the Office of Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency through the Department of Commerce to help put on this webinar. We had a lot of feedback last year from our Evolution Egg Summit on people had a lot of questions that they wish they would have came prepared a little bit more. So based on that feedback, we are doing a pre-webinar on Carbon 101 with Dr. Dave Ripplinger, who will kind of set the day for the Evolution Egg Summit. And so Dave, I just want to give a little bit of background on Dave. Dave has had over 12 years of experience, or over a decade of experience in bioengineering. He is a professor in extension bioproducts economics at NDSU. Dave will explain how carbon reduction initiatives are shaping our food and agricultural supply chains. He will set the stage for the Evolution Egg Summit that is held on February 20th and will provide an overview of how corporate carbon reduction initiatives and renewable fuel trends and carbon markets are setting opportunities for farmers and ranchers. Just a few housekeeping tip things before I turn it over to Dave. Everyone is on mute. However, at any time you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A and we will have Q&A questions at the end. Also, this webinar is being recorded, so if you are not able to attend all of it or know people who weren't able to watch it, we will be sharing this out through email, or you can also find it on our NDFU YouTube channel page, where we also have a lot of other educational webinars that we've been hosting the past several months. And then I also want to say that we really invite you to join us next week, Tuesday, here live in Jamestown at the NDFU headquarters for our Evolution Egg Summit. And we have a great lineup of speakers that will be joining us today, including Dave, along with many other experts in the room. So if you guys if you haven't seen the agenda, here's a quick look at all the guest speakers we have and panelists that will be representing us. So highly encourage you to check out the NDFU page and attend that. I know there's been some questions if the actual live event on February 20th will be recorded. Unfortunately, we will not be. That is a live in-day event. We just feel that you get a lot more for people in the room. However, besides this webinar, we are doing a post-webinar with Dr. Dave Ripplinger and Dr. Lindsay Malone and Dr. Miranda Meehan, who is also from NDSU, and that will be more of a Q&A. So if you attend the Evolution Egg Summit, or regardless if you don't, and just listen to today's recording, this is a great opportunity to come back and ask some experts on some different questions. And again, so I will be sharing the link to register for this event through email and also in the Q&A. So if anybody wants to register for the post webinar on March 1st, where it's really just open discussion to ask Dave and Lindsay and Miranda any questions. So with that, I am going to stop sharing and turn it over to you, Dave, to give us a high overview of Carbon 101. Let me just, all right, there you go. Thanks, Dave.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Amanda. The only thing I'd like to begin is a slight caveat. So you've heard my name quite a few times throughout this program. There is a lot of other quality content outside of me. So if by chance you're not extremely enticed by my talk and say, boy, I don't know if I want a bunch more, Dave, there'll be a lot of other things during the program next Tuesday, as well as the webinar that follows. As Amanda mentioned, I'm going to give an overview of a lot of things that are kind of foundational in this space, and there's a lot. So I'm going to go through some very high points relatively quickly to hopefully prepare you for next week's program and other things you might do in this space, it did require me to, not go in depth, as well as to squeeze quite a bit in. And so I hope I can make the most of the next half hour or so that we have for the presentation, and then those questions afterwards. So just kind of jumping in. So in the last 4 or 5 years, there's been a lot of discussion of carbon and agriculture, especially production ag, and especially in the Midwest. And the reason this is happening to some extent is because agriculture has a lot of interactions with the environment, and we also use a lot of inputs to grow the food and other products, the fuels, the fibers that we need. And so agriculture does have a huge carbon footprint because we do a lot of work, which is required by society. We also have a really unique opportunity because we interact with the soil to capture possibly atmospheric carbon or other carbon and place it in the ground for some period of time. So in the last 4 or 5 years, it's really been carbon contracts that have been getting a lot of attention. But it's important to note that's really only a small piece of what's going on right now, not the most important, and may not be the most important in the future as well, but it has drawn attention to the issue. So just to talk about carbon specifically, so carbon is used in a variety of ways when talking about greenhouse gas emissions, and it really can have really one of 3 different meanings. One, it could refer to all greenhouse gas emissions. So when we might say carbon, we're talking about all emissions in an industry or in society. We might be talking about CO2, carbon dioxide specifically, because that is the largest greenhouse gas by volume. Or in some cases, we actually are just talking about carbon, the molecule, especially if we're talking about carbon capture in the soil. We're really talking about carbon itself. But typically from the context, whenever you hear carbon, one of those 3 definitions will kind of be understood. But again, as we talk about carbon 101 or the carbon conundrum, it can take these different dimensions. And the default for me, at least, is we're talking about greenhouse gases and we're talking about climate. A little bit more information, foundational for some things I'm going to talk about. It's important to understand how the math for greenhouse gas emissions is done. And right now, especially how it applies to corporations. There's really 3 different parts of what's going on in carbon. One is corporate activities, the other is biofuels, and then the third is government activities. And so I'm going to start on the corporate side because that's where most farmers have been initially nudged, or when this has really been brought to their attention first. And so talking really high level, there's a lot of work that's being done to develop reporting rules, as well as developing systems within businesses or units within businesses to measure corporate emissions. And what's important for us today and next week is to understand part of how we put these different emissions into buckets. And we can think about any business, but each business typically has emissions that go into 1 of 3 buckets, and we call them scopes. So the first is direct emissions. So those are emissions that a business that releases directly. And so you can see that little figure. That could be the vehicles used, so the fuel used to power those vehicles, or it could be emissions from directly heating one of their facilities. Scope 2 is purchased input. So when you buy power off the grid, that's going to have emissions. That's scope 2. And then finally, and most important for agriculture, are scope 3 emissions. And so these are emissions all the way up and down the supply chain. And this is important because farmers are in a number of supply chains. We're familiar with this to some extent. We think about or are familiar with where crops might go, the ultimate feed or food or biofuel markets they end up in. But we might not think about the idea that the emissions that we have actually impact the emissions that those final products have including food products. And so you are in likely a variety of different scope 3 emissions for these different multinational food companies. It might be because you grow a feed, if you grow corn or soybeans and it ends up in being used as animal feed, you're likely in a livestock meat company's scope 3, for example, Tyson. You know, if you grow one of the many different food crops that we grow in the state, you're likely, you know, very close to being in one of these scope 3s as well. And again, it extends a variety of ways, from barley and beer to durum and pasta. You know, you can think about the different crops and if and when it might interact with the corporation. So those are scope 3s. So what we've actually heard most about, and this is kind of the first leg, are carbon contracts. So this is actually something a little bit different, even though it's our first exposure generally to carbon in agriculture. So these carbon contracts have involved farmers and typically brokers. The farmers would sign a contract, receive a cash payment in return for adopting a new practice. Now, what's interesting about this is these carbon contracts end up producing carbon credits or carbon offsets, which are then used by multinational corporations to offset their emissions, The reason why they're offsets is because typically these companies don't have farmers directly in their supply chain. So the bigger buyers of these to date have been the Disneys and the Microsofts of the world. And they've been looking ways to offset their corporate emissions. They don't have the easiest ways to do it, scope 1, 2, or 3, so they look elsewhere. And so this has led to the development of a number of businesses, a number of contracts, and this whole system where farmers oftentimes are able to or may be able to enter into these agreements. So again, this is that carbon offset. We've heard this a lot, but it's important to kind of put a pin in it. Again, so you're not in these businesses' supply chains, and what you're doing is offsetting that other company's emissions. You're going to receive payment for that. A bit of discussion. I think some of these practices and terms in these carbon contracts, carbon offset contracts, are generally known and pretty well understood. Over the last few years, they've received a lot of attention. But again, we're really looking at ways to either reduce emissions or to capture and store carbon in the soil. So tillage gets a lot of attention, cover crops get a lot of attention, and then nutrient management oftentimes gets a lot of attention because there's significant emissions associated with fertilizer use. The actual terms can vary quite a bit in terms of their length. Most are a year long, maybe a few years long, but they could be longer. And the amount varies in terms of the payment. And so oftentimes it's, you know, the practice and the payment per acre per year. You know, $5 is really very much on the low end. That is not enticing for most of these practices. And it could be $10, $20, or even $40 an acre. Again, this is by practice. And what's done is we take that practice and we map it into the carbon emissions that might be avoided or the carbon that might be captured and stored. And that's where that $5 or $10 might come from. In North Dakota, one thing that a lot of folks are familiar with, because it's not particularly appealing, is it has to be a new practice. And so this is a concept called additionality. And this is particularly difficult because one of the interests is in reduced or no-till crop production. But if you've been doing that for years or decades, especially longer, you're often not able to participate in these carbon offset contracts for that practice. And so there's kind of this feeling of inherent unfairness because you may have had a no-till operation for a few decades, and yet you can't sign a carbon offset contract for that practice specifically. Sometimes these contracts are bundled with other services. There's a lot of ag companies that have moved into this, and they want you to think of carbon offsets and carbon contracts as part of this bigger system, especially as it might include purchasing or the tracking of the use of different inputs. because it's kind of a natural complement to where these businesses are. Some of the contracts may include clawback provisions. So they may, you're going to make a promise to adopt certain practices to do certain things. There's also an expectation that the impacts will be as expected. And then if those impacts aren't there, those payments may be clawed back to some extent. And so this could be something, as obvious as saying, well, you didn't do what you said you were going to do. But it could also be expectations that the company you signed a contract with thought that more carbon would be captured. And then they may go out and test and then realize, oh, wow, this isn't here. And so they may or may not ask you to pay back some of the initial payment. One of the good pieces of news is that typically you're allowed to stack, and that is participate in government programs, which there are quite a few that align with these different practices. So you can participate in an NRCS program and sign a carbon offset contract and receive payment for both. Quite a bit on that slide. One thing I want to bring to your attention, because this is new to many in production agriculture, is what are called carbon insets. And so this is different in that you are talking about your emissions in someone else's supply chain. So this could be an input company, fertilizer company, or it could be a food, biofuel, other company whose supply chain you're in. So this is an inset because your emissions or reductions in emissions impact these other businesses in your supply chain. You don't necessarily have to have a contract or an agreement, but folks may recognize your current carbon emissions or those that you might make. Also, they're typically not concerned with additionality. For example, a lot of the crops that we produce in the state, are under no-till conditions. Well, you've already got that smaller carbon footprint. And so a buyer of spring wheat, for example, could and should be able to take credit for that because the carbon footprint of that wheat is substantially smaller than it would be if it was grown under conventional tillage. And so that, again, is a carbon inset. And to some extent, it addresses those concerns or limitations about additionality. Continuing on, and this does align with what we've talked about so far, ESG and greenhouse gas reporting. So environmental, social, and governance issues, ESG, have gotten a lot of attention. Some of it not properly understood, and the actual actions of corporations not necessarily well communicated. It is a very important issue. I'm going to focus on this slide about things coming from the private sector. It has been difficult for some industries to receive financing. And in fact, in North Dakota, a good example of that are fossil fuel companies have had difficulty securing financing because concerns about ESG. At the same time, other dimensions of ESG, social issues, how do these businesses impact people, or governance, how they're governed, how they operate, have also received attention. And one of the big examples of this was a letter written by Larry Fink almost exactly 2 years ago, where he mentioned that his business, BlackRock Financial, which is by far the largest financial institution in the world, really needs to see ESG reporting. And so this is interesting because all they want is a report. BlackRock, which because they're large shareholders of a number of businesses, do have seats, either, typically directly on the board as well as voting rights as shareholders. They haven't been particularly activist, but they're saying, we want you to report because we see it as a risk or a concern to the value of your company. Building on that just a little bit, but going to the government side, and this is something that might be new to a lot of folks, but is of critical importance, including in North Dakota agriculture, something called climate disclosure laws. So we're seeing laws come into effect internationally, nationally, and at the state level that are going to require businesses to report climate risks and their actual emissions. The one that typically had the most interest until recently with some proposed rules from the SEC, the Securities Commission. Added some things, and that got pushed.
I think we've lost Dave. Let me see if we can get him back. Apologize, everybody, for that. Um, Let me quick see if I can find Dave here. Thank you all for your patience while this is happening. Again, as I said, this will be recorded, and so if things, we'll make sure that we get this edited. So if some of you have to jump off early, hopefully we can. Oh, there's Dave. We will have that fixed. So, Dave, you're on mute, but we can see you.
Yeah, can you put me on co-host again, please?
Yes, sorry.
Thank you. Yep, I got kicked off, but I'll jump back in. Great, thank you. Let's see, slide 10.
And again, while Dave is getting ready, everybody, this is being recorded, and Dave will surely share these slides. So
Yep.
we'll make sure that you get this information. Thank you,
Yep.
Dave.
Did I complete this slide? I didn't complete this slide.
I don't think so.
Yeah. So again, these climate disclosure laws are coming into effect, and they're going to have a big impact on production agriculture, especially North Dakota. And the reason I say that is because we grow a lot of different food crops. The specialty crops, minor food crops, they're all subject to this, and they hit these different potentially regulated companies a lot sooner. But the first example of this was the Securities Exchange Commission and publicly traded companies. That got a lot of attention. There's pushback. So right now, the SEC has said they're not looking at Scope 3 emissions and won't be soon, which is somewhat good news. But again, this would apply to the General Mills and the Nestle's of the world who are publicly traded. And we might not often think about it, but a lot of times our products, our crops are sold into markets like this. Our calves that we raise, in North Dakota end up touching these companies. So the SEC pulled back, and so that was somewhat good news. At the same time, the state of California passed into law climate disclosure law, which is going to impact larger businesses that are active in the state. And so while we might have thought the SEC pulling back was this question, California's law, it's going to affect most businesses, and a lot of these businesses are food or egg companies. And so as these laws come into effect, especially with Scope 3, this is going to impact North Dakota businesses at farms relatively soon. At the same time, the European Union, European Commission, they just started requiring reporting this year. And this is important because we export a lot of products into the EU. And, as we, sell our crops, particularly into Europe, you're going to have these same reporting requirements. They're going to want to know the carbon footprint of our crops. An example of carbon insets, and this is picked among many for no reason other than it's generally easy to see and understand. So ADM has a program called Regenerations. This is a carbon inset program. And basically, for these different practices, as you can see, cover crops and nutrient management tillage, for bigger commodities, corn, soybean, wheat, canola, and peanuts, they will pay a small premium at some delivery locations simply for the practice. And so this is very much an inset, an example of an inset. You can make an extra 2 to 4 cents a bushel because you use cover crops, have alternative tillage, manage your nutrients in a certain way. And again, this is of interest because the idea would be that the ultimate buyers of those commodities would also value the smaller carbon footprint. And again, so this is very much a pilot today, but to me, a very good example of where things will be going in the future. And again, we can just think about this. Eventually, we'll likely have companies and a bit of a premium at those local elevators that will say, yes, we'll give you an extra 5 or 20 cents a bushel for spring wheat grown on no-till. And so that's really exciting, really interesting. And again, this, to me, this will come, at some time, but if you are understanding how this works, this seems a lot easier than having to deal with carbon contracts. And I do expect that this will be the far more dominant way in which farmers receive payment for their practices. I'm going to speak just briefly about biofuel related carbon markets, carbon, how it impacts North Dakota agriculture. It's very important, but it's somewhat indirect. The biggest policy right now is really a California policy, which incentivizes low carbon fuels. So that's caused a lot of activity in the biofuel market, has encouraged a lot of ethanol refineries, including those in North Dakota, to make certain investments to reduce their carbon footprint. It doesn't quite get back to the farmer yet, but the hope is it will sometime soon. California is really not aggressively working to get farm level emissions incorporated. At the same time, there are other policies where they are working on that. And actually, the first best example of that is Canada. So Canada recently enacted what they call their clean fuel regulations. And so there they will actually allow refineries to differentiate carbon footprint. And so this is interesting. So we could have a refinery in the state of North Dakota who could say 20% of our corn comes from no-till production. And by providing that information to the regulator in Ottawa, they could have a smaller carbon footprint, create more carbon credits, and receive, essentially more income because they source no-till corn. And this is interesting because we are in North Dakota and we do have and long exported ethanol into Canada. We have transportation advantages into Canada for both what I'll call low carbon corn and low carbon canola. There seem to be special opportunities with this. There's another possible opportunity for farm level practices being incentivized. There was a new tax credit called 45Z. This tax credit will pay for incrementally smaller carbon footprints, but we don't know if they're going to go back to the farm level. IRS is currently making those rules. If they include farm level practices, it will have an immediate and tremendous impact on production agriculture. Again, because I could be incentivized as a farmer to document if I already have the practices or to add these new practices that reduce my carbon footprint. And so again, we talked about, no-till is an obvious one. The other one might be the purchase of low carbon fertilizer, which is increasingly being available on the market, but there's really not a pull. But this might create a pull for that low carbon fertilizer and for that crop produced with that fertilizer to be sold to a biorefinery. The last thing I'm going to talk about, kind of this fourth leg, is farm policy. And so we've seen that the federal government come into this market a little bit slow, initially not much, and then very, very aggressively. So in 2021, during one of the COVID bills, they did include a $5 payment for farmers who had cover crops. Bigger than that, and kind of a bigger sign of what might be to come, the federal government is building out support for what they call climate smart agriculture. And this hits on both of those issues, reducing emissions in agriculture and using agriculture as a way to capture and store carbon. The first thing they did was push out $3.1 billion for a partnership program. And I know North Dakota Farmers Union is an active member of one of the bigger projects that was successful in receiving funding. And then a year and a half ago, with the Inflation Reduction Act, $20 billion was provided to fund climate smart ag practices through NRCS. So a lot of money that lasts through 2026, which is not that long. And then like the bigger question a lot of us have is what will this mean for future farm bills in terms of funding and working out this balance between the different interests and the needs associated here with climate. And so those are all very, very important programs here. The partnership program is really looking at having different pilot projects across the country, look at different ways that we could incentivize reduced emissions in ag. One of the last points I want to make is with regard to carbon liability. This is something a lot of folks have missed. Every business, every individual, your farm, me individually, we all have carbon liabilities. So we have emissions. And there's a possibility, a likelihood that sometime those liabilities will be realized. The picture I have on the slide is from a farmer in Saskatchewan who has to pay a federal carbon tax for the purchase and use of natural gas. And this has been modified a bit with recent policy. But at the time, you can see that they paid for the delivery and the physical supply of gas, and then they had to pay a carbon tax on it. And so the reason I bring this up is because I'm sure a decade ago, this farmer did not think that this was going to be a cost, but it very much is a real cost that farmer has to endure. And then my favorite thing about this, if you look a little bit closer, it says federal carbon charge, and then it says federal GST. So you actually pay federal tax on the carbon tax. They kind of double up, which is a bit humorous. But really the point of this is for folks to understand it's not just these big companies that are being exposed. For them, again, these climate disclosure laws, but because your farm has emissions, you have to think about what they are and how it might be advantageous to do certain things. Most folks don't understand this. They would think that they may or may not have it. And then if they do, the price of it's zero. And this is really important because a lot of times with carbon offset contracts, farmers don't think about the value of that carbon to their own operation, which is a significant oversight. Those were the prepared comments I had. I know it's a lot. I hope there's a lot of questions. And I'm happy to field whatever might be thrown my way. And I'll stop sharing.
Well, thank you, Dave. Again, just want to reiterate that this is being recorded and these slides will be shared with you because there is a lot of information and probably will have a lot of questions that will be coming, if not today, at the actual Evolution Ag. So one of the questions that we do have, again, if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A. As we look ahead, what are some of the key ways companies can strengthen their partnership with farmers and ranchers to reach sustainable goals?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, I mean, that's one of the things that we are experiencing in agriculture. There's an adage that businesses don't compete, supply chains compete. And that's going to be very true as we look at carbon in agriculture. We already have generally strong partnerships to some extent on the input side, on the product side. And that might be something like knowing your sales rep well, right? Knowing or being a member of the cooperative that's going to end up marketing your grain. Again, we already have a lot of that. And that's going to continue to grow. Part of that is going to be, again, because your farm is part of those supply chains and your emissions matter. So your input suppliers and the buyers of your product are going to know what's going on. And they're also going to want to encourage you to find ways to reduce your emissions. And that's going to be both in terms of doing it, but then also tracking it. And so there's this whole effort being done to better measure, monitor, record, and verify emissions. And so that might mean additional technology on your tractor, on your combine, at your operation, so that that information can be collected and shared. And again, it's likely going to be shared with these different folks that you already interact with or may interact with. Again, really supporting that strengthening partnership, driven in large part by sustainability.
Steve, another question. Carbon offsets are a very touchy subject because it allows corporates to greenwash themselves. Will the carbon offsets increase in value over time to the benefit of the farmers? And how do we build pressure in future reducing those emissions?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I'm not going to get into some of the more delicate things with that, with the greenwashing. But if you think from the perspective of a corporation, they have independently identified their emissions as a concern. And that can be for a variety of reasons. One, as I mentioned, it could be because they're concerned about getting financing. It could be a concern with marketing their products. It could be concern with the risks their business is exposed to with climate. It could be because they're preparing for regulation. And so that's the motivation for these multinationals to enter carbon offset markets. They've done it in a variety of ways. It's not just agriculture. They actually did forestry first, and basically exhausted those opportunities. Agriculture, again, has this huge, tremendous amount of interaction with the environment. So an opportunity to reduce emissions or capture carbon and store it. In terms of the outlook on carbon credit price and offset markets, your guess is as good as mine. If you think about these businesses, they're really not engaged tremendously in purchasing enough carbon offsets because it's independently driven, but they're looking for a few things. One, they want to have diverse sources of offsets. They want to have low cost sources of offsets. They generally want defensible sources of offsets. They're not coming to agriculture and paying what they are because they want to pay a premium, right? So they are very much supporting these early activities with this kind of longer term outlook of, if we have to go and buy a tremendous amount of offset credits, if that's what works best for us, is there a system in place? And so a lot of this is rolling out the system, not necessarily marrying up supply and demand for these offsets. And so you really can say that the current price of offsets is an equilibrium because a lot of these buyers are not actively continually engaged, nor are the suppliers. And because there's so much uncertainty in terms of what regulation might be or the interests of any given corporation, it's really tough to think about what the prices are. What I would say, and it's somewhat alluded to, the prices that farmers have been receiving for carbon offset credits for those contracts is generally substantially lower than what other carbon markets are paying. For example, the California low carbon fuel standard market, the value of their credits are about double of what farmers are receiving for carbon offsets. The difference is you can actually receive that carbon offset payment. In the California market, that's a market that doesn't reach farmers. It's for folks further down the supply chain, the biorefiners, the refiners, the marketers of refined petroleum products. And so in general, my thought is if you can make money today selling a carbon offset today, you're probably not missing out on much. If you're signing a contract for 10 years, you may be exposing yourself. Again, I can't necessarily predict the price of those credits. And also too, there's a credibility issue. So how good is that carbon credit? So we've seen a lot of offset projects exposed for really not reducing emissions or capturing carbon. And so there's risk of destabilization in these markets, which are already small. A lot of different things go into it. And again, if I knew like the value of anything, if I knew what the value of carbon offsets were going to be in 5 or 10 years, I might not be visiting with you today. So we really don't know.
Thanks, Dave. These two questions I think kind of go hand in hand, but is there somewhere where people can find like a spreadsheet or some type of information showing the type of practice that a farmer is doing or the crop and their respective supporting level um, for the market price of these carbon practices and stuff?
Yeah. So my general recommendation is to access extension because many, but not all, extension systems may have a calculator or tool to help estimate the returns on these practices. And the advice I always give, and I'll be giving next week, and we'll go into this a little bit more in depth then. There are the financial dimensions of this, there's the non-financial dimensions of this, and then let's add the carbon thing at the end. So let's and take any given practice, but we can talk about going no-till. And one, most of these practices are very complex and have a variety of impacts that are not, they don't have a market. So how do I value prevention of soil erosion or retention of moisture? That's tough. That's kind of on you. That's internal. So what I always say is work through the financial part first. What is it going to cost me? And I can probably get pretty good estimates what the yield drag might be in early years. See if it pencils out. Your lender might be very interested in seeing if it pencils out dollars and cents wise. Then you have these non-financial costs and benefits, which you typically are going to want to lean towards the positive. And then my recommendation is if the financial part makes sense and the non-financial part makes sense, then finally look at carbon markets. Don't do that first. Go find that calculator first, work through that process first. And then once you've either identified, gosh, going no-till is a no-brainer, right? I'm going to do that. Then I would actually actively, aggressively look to find folks in that market. If it's close, I would have a conversation with them. In a lot of cases, the economics of adopting these practices are, again, complex and really lean one way or another without even considering carbon offsets. And so, again, my advice is to find these tools, use those tools, and then consider if the carbon price tips things one way or another. Not thinking, gosh, I can get an extra $10 an acre. And I think we understand this and we know what these practices generally entail. And I'd also say too, if you're in an area where no-till is, all but universal, or you already are no-till, it doesn't matter for offsets. If you're in an area where some of your neighbors do, and again, this is just kind of that clue that it might be economical, go and talk to your trusted advisor in terms of your soils and your own farm or field level agronomics, because not every field should be a no-till or have cover crops. And then, continue to work in that way to make this ultimately really complex decision. There was a lot to say. Yeah, it's not an easy answer. But again, this is also why we want to get folks engaged in this, because it is a big decision for these operations to make.
Right. And I think just one thing to point out too that Dave kind of alluded to, it's not necessarily just selling your markets, selling your carbon markets. It's also thinking about the the agronomic or the beneficials that you'll have for water quality, your soil quality, and that's why at the Evolution Ag we will be having Dr. Lindsay Malone talk about some agronomic stuff that a lot of farmers and ranchers are already doing in North Dakota, along with Dr. Miranda Meham, who is a livestock specialist, who will be, incorporating and talking about that stuff too. So I think a lot of people need to also think about the stuff that you might not physically be seeing, but you're already doing a lot of these benefits. So um, a few more questions here. Um, uh, in reaction to the carbon liability, is there a risk that if an egg producer participates in carbon offset markets now, that their supply chain will be unavailable to cover its own footprint in the future?
Yes. Yeah, and so that's the warning or the caution. And the best example of that is, let's say that you signed a long-term contract, so a multi-year, let's say it's a decade contract for offsets. You've essentially, a lot of farmers think, well, I'm getting paid $10 an acre, $20 an acre to grow cover crops. But again, what the corporation is buying, they don't care about cover crops, right? They want those credits. So they've essentially purchased those credits. So then when you go to the elevator, and let's say it's like ADM, you could check a box that say you do cover crops. Well, you really can't, because you've sold those benefits. And so this does become, and it's related to that question about the outlook on price. If you sell at a low value, you're going to find yourself in a spot, and you may lose a market, you may lose a premium or whatever that higher or whatever that price might be, or you may be required to go out and buy offsets yourself. And that makes the situation really unique, and for me, way too complex for farmers who have many other important things to worry about. And so that makes me lean towards, and most carbon offset contracts are for a few years. So that reduces this risk of adverse movement in the price of offsets and the impact it might have on a farmer's ability to market their crop.
Um, Dave, how accurate and consistent are these measurements for offsets?
Okay, so this is great. I'm not a soil scientist, but I talk to soil scientists about this all the time. And in general, we can talk about measurement, and because this is really one of the bigger issues, right? I can easily measure and track, or relatively easy measure and track, fertilizer application, right? Even at a very high level, I bought this many tons and applied it across my operation. Or the far end, I have precision ag equipment and I have it tracked, by the square meter. Right. It's really the soil carbon that's of more interest. And there's two things going on. There's the issue with technology and measurement, which is not as well developed as some people think. And then there's the actual capture and storage of carbon in the soil, which is not as permanent as a lot of people think. And this is where I would lean towards my colleagues at NDSU or other land grants, repeating what they've universally told me. We're much of that carbon that's trapped in the soil is actually living microbes, and then as they die or when certain processes in the soil take place, that carbon that was stored can be re-emitted into the atmosphere. And if we think about what we're talking about with global warming, we need something much more permanent than that. And so there's a disconnect to some extent between what people think happens with carbon in the soil and what typically happens. And that's something that we need to address more vocally, because it's a critical concern. So again, you have measurement issues, and then you have the actual amount, again, the amount that you measure and the actual type or the form in which that carbon is being stored in the soil.
Okay. We have time for one more question. And Dave, I know you didn't talk a whole lot about low carbon fuel markets, but I know you're an expert in this area. So as you've talked about that and we've talked about kind of what that means, but what does that trend of low carbon fuel markets mean for farmers and ranchers?
Yeah, great question. And again, if I had more time, we could talk about almost any of these for an hour ish, right? And even more so on the biofuel side. So as that system matures, and this is both regulations become more mature, technology matures, uh, we're going to see the the production of crops be incentivized. And again, the biofuel industry, especially talking about California, it's so much more developed and has the force of law. Same thing in Canada. Same thing with the RFS, which is not quite as important. You know, they have a true pull on markets, and we're simply waiting for them to have increased connection to the farmer. In California, there's really none and probably won't be for decades. With Canada, there's some. If 45Z is fully built out, it could be immediate and direct, a variety of these ways. But yes, as those policies and the regulations and the bureaucracy forms around them and the technology uh, forms so we can better measure, monitor, record, validate, we will see uh, significant incentives or disincentives for farmers to grow certain crops certain ways. And, you know, if we think about North Dakota, this extends to corn for ethanol and soybeans and canola specifically for biodiesel and renewable diesel. You know, all three of those are exciting. Um, at the same time, if we think, and I mentioned it specifically, the Canadian example. So Canada is going to allow biorefiners to note the production practices used to grow their crops. Well, if I have no-till canola or no-till corn or no-till soybeans, that has a much smaller carbon footprint. And that could get back to the farmer relatively quickly. It's exciting. It's also one of like tempered expectations in terms of the timing because it will take a few years.
Well, thank you, Dave. I know there's been a lot of questions that have come in, and I'll share those with you too if you want to reach out to any of those. Again, thank you everybody for joining today's call. I know there's a lot of information, and this is a lot to wrap your head around. Again, we invite you to the Evolution Ag next week, Tuesday, here live at the North Dakota Farmers Union headquarters in Jamestown. That will not be recorded, but Dave will be there. As he said, he'll kind of be going through some economic little activity to kind of talk about some of what he's talked about today. We'll also have other experts from the University of North Dakota State University, individuals from the private and public sector, such as U.S. Sustainable Beef, ADM, ESMC, you name it, there will be a lot of guest speakers. We'll also have vendors that if you are there, you can reach out and talk to them about certain things. We'll have lots of resources such as the NRCS will be there and also some other things. NDSU will have a booth. So you'll have the chance to talk with Dave if you come up with some more questions. So again, thank you, Dave, for giving us a quick snapshot onto what Carbon 101 is. I'd also like to thank, again, this webinar is being presented by NDSU Extension, the North Dakota Ethanol Council, and the Office of Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency through the North Dakota Department of Congress. Um, with that, as I said, this is being recorded. Everybody should be getting a link to this recording along with that post Evolution Ag webinar that is happening March 1st with Dave and some other NDSU Extension professors. You do not have to attend the Evolution Ag Summit to join that webinar, but there might be some questions and content that might be directly driven from the actual Evolution Ag Summit. And if you want to watch this recording, you can go on to the NDFU YouTube channel. I've put a lot of links into the chat. And with that, thank you everybody for joining us today. Hopefully you found this somewhat educational and have some questions for Dave if you can join us. If not, Dave's information is on those slides. So if you want to reach out to Dave, I'm sure that he'd be more than happy to either email you or chat with you on some of these questions. So again, thank you everybody for joining us, and we look forward and hopefully see you next week. Bye, everybody.